The glass wall exploded in a flash of white light and ringing air. Camila Reyes, 24, a Latina waitress who'd learned to stay invisible to survive, had already noticed the pattern, the same black sedan lingering by the valet doors for the third time. Not right. Not right. Not right. Her mind snapped, sharp as a reflex. Near the window, a gloved hand lifted a slim metal tube, calm and venomous as a viper's tooth. She didn't think. Thinking takes time, and time kills, her oldest rule. Down. Damian Cross sat 8 meters away, immaculate in a navy suit, a man who looked untouchable. Camila surged forward, heels skidding on polished marble, the scent of champagne and citrus rising, soft jazz still playing like the world hadn't noticed danger. She crashed into his chair and threw herself over him as the next sound arrived. For a breath, the room went louder than screaming, then fell into a silence that felt wrong, like the building itself was holding its lungs. Glittering shards clung to Camila's sleeves and hair, catching the sunlight like cruel confetti under the gold New Year streamers. Damian's hand found her forearm, gripping tight, not sure if he was steadying her or himself. Around them, guests froze mid-toast, mouths open, eyes wide, the smell of spilled bubbly mixing with sharp dust from the shattered wall. Camila stayed low, listening, not for applause, not for thanks, but for what always comes after the first strike. Footsteps pounded in from every direction as security flooded the room, voices clipped, radios hissing, the brunch turning into a lockdown in seconds. Someone hauled Camila back, not gently, as if bravery could be treated like a mistake that needed to be contained. Damian rose slowly, controlled on the outside, but his gaze kept returning to her with a new kind of focus. Less like a billionaire surveying a problem, more like a man realizing he owed a debt he couldn't pay with money. On the floor, celebration lay broken, toppled flutes, fallen ribbons, sunlight fractured into 1,000 hard reflections. And in that glittering wreckage, Camila felt the spotlight settle on her like a weight. She had lived her whole life avoiding attention, yet now every eye in the room seemed to know her name without saying it. Damian's people began asking questions, where she was standing, what she saw, who she knew, each word tightening the air around her. Beyond the ruined window, the city looked calm and indifferent, as if nothing had happened, as if the world could shrug and move on. But Camila didn't shrug. She remembered the black sedan, the timing, the certainty in that gloved hand. Somewhere outside, the driver was already gone. And she knew, with cold clarity, that this was only the first move. The screaming didn't stop all at once. It thinned, thread by thread, until what remained was a hush so unnatural it made every sound feel exposed. Shoes squeaked on polished marble. A radio hissed. Somewhere a glass kept tinkling as it settled, like the room refusing to believe what had happened. Camila sat low beside a table leg, her back pressed into the cold, her hands shaking even as she tried to command them into stillness. Above her, the gold New Year streamers swayed gently, bright and festive, as if they hadn't just watched the world crack open. A medic crouched near her and asked her name, and speaking it aloud felt like stepping into a spotlight she'd spent her whole life avoiding. Her sleeve glittered with tiny shards that looked pretty from far away, but up close they were sharp, stubborn, and too real. The scent of champagne and citrus had turned sour in the air, mixed with dust and the faint sting of something sprayed to sanitize the scene. Camila's eyes kept drifting against her will to the shattered wall, wealth reduced to broken reflections. And then she felt it. Damian Cross looking at her from across the room, not with thanks yet, but with a careful intensity, like she was a number that didn't belong in his equation. Security moved her away from the brunch floor into a private corridor where carpet swallowed sound and the light seemed cooler, more controlled. A guard stood by the door with a polite face and a firm posture, the kind of kindness that still meant, "Don't leave." Camila lifted her chin anyway, because pride was sometimes the only coat she owned. She could hear muffled voices beyond the hallway, guests calling, managers panicking, a distant, frantic energy trying to disguise itself as order. Her heart kept replaying the black sedan at the valet, the timing, the calmness of that gloved hand, the way danger had arrived like it belonged there. Damian entered without any dramatic flourish, just a quiet presence that made the air feel narrower. His suit was still perfect, but something in his eyes had shifted, cracked, not broken, like steel warmed by fire. He spoke softly, controlled, as if emotion was a language he didn't use often. "I owe you," he said, and the simplicity of it hit harder than any grand speech could have. Camila didn't know what to do with a debt from a man who lived above consequences, a man outside her world, in every way that mattered. Outside the corridor, the hotel began turning into a story other people would tell. Phones lighting up, whispers multiplying, reputations calculating their escape routes. A man in a suit asked Camila to repeat what she saw, and each question felt like a rope tightening, slow and patient. Camila answered carefully, but inside she could still see the pattern, still feel the inevitability of it, like footsteps behind her in a dark street. She had saved Damian Cross with 1 second of instinct, yet now, in the clean hush of that hallway, she understood with a cold clarity that surviving the moment was only the beginning. Before the glass and the shouting, Camila's mornings began in the dark, long before the city put on its confident face. She woke to an alarm that sounded like a warning, dressed quietly so she wouldn't wake the neighbors, and stepped into the hallway with her shoes in her hand. The air outside was cool and faintly damp, smelling of concrete and yesterday's rain, and the bus stop light flickered like it couldn't decide whether to stay on. She kept her shoulders slightly forward, not from shame but from habit, like someone who learned early that attention can be a kind of danger. In this city, being unnoticed wasn't loneliness to her, it was safety. At the hotel, everything was built to make people like her disappear in plain sight. Polished floors that showed every scuff, warm lighting that softened expensive faces, the steady clink of silverware and the low music that made even impatience sound refined. Camila moved through it all with a practiced smile, refilling water, clearing plates, hearing snippets of conversations that felt like another language. Numbers, mergers, vacations, names that floated like they owned air. Sometimes guests spoke to her without looking at her, and sometimes they looked at her like she was part of the furniture. She learned to swallow small humiliations the way you swallow bitter medicine, quickly, without letting it show. She carried one small thing that belonged only to her, an old rosary worn smooth from fingers that had prayed through harder nights than this. It stayed in her pocket, tucked close like a heartbeat you could borrow when yours started to race. Her mother had once told her, softly and firmly, that courage wasn't loud, it was simply doing what was right when nobody would clap. Camila didn't think of herself as brave. She thought of herself as careful, disciplined, the kind of person who survived by staying out of the way. And yet, on that New Year morning, something felt different, like the air had a hidden current. It started small, so small most people would have missed it. The same black sedan by the valet again, too patient for a busy holiday brunch. A man near the glass wall who looked wrong for the room, not dressed like a guest, not moving like staff. And then, that third time, her mind clicked into a cold, sharp awareness, the kind you get when you've seen trouble before, and it always begins the same way. Her fingers brushed the rosary in her pocket without meaning to, and a thought rose with quiet certainty. I've seen him. The realization landed like a stone in her stomach, heavy and unmistakable. They didn't let Camila return to the dining room the way she'd left it. A security lead in a crisp suit guided her through service corridors that smelled of linen carts and disinfectant, away from the glittering wreckage and the frozen faces. The hotel's soft music was gone here, replaced by radios whispering codes and doors clicking shut. Every turn felt like a reminder. Luxury had a hidden backbone, and it could tighten without warning. Camila kept walking anyway, chin steady, hands folded so no one would see them tremble. They placed her in a private lounge with beige walls and art that looked expensive but meant nothing. A bottle of water sat untouched on the table, like a gesture that couldn't decide if it was kindness or caution. Two men asked her to repeat everything, where she stood, what she saw, what she heard, careful voices, sharp pens. Camila answered with the same discipline she used on crowded buses at night, short, clear, no extra. Still, she could feel it, the way their attention circled her like a spotlight searching for a mistake. When Damian Cross entered, the room changed temperature without changing air. He moved with the quiet certainty of someone who never had to hurry, even now, even after glass and chaos. His security shifted subtly, as if the world angled itself to make space for him. Damian's expression stayed controlled, but his gaze paused on Camila in a way that wasn't casual, like he was looking at the exact second she had become unavoidable. "Camila Reyes," he said, reading her name as if he was anchoring it to memory, and for her that alone felt dangerous. Outside the closed door, the hotel buzzed with a restrained panic, investors on phones, staff whispering, reputation being measured in real time. Damian spoke with a low steadiness, offering protection, medical care, a place to stay, the kind of solutions his money could summon instantly. Camila heard the offer and also heard the shadow behind it. Safety that might come with silence, help that might come with control. She tightened her grip on the worn rosary in her pocket, grounding herself in something that didn't belong to him. And as Damian's eyes held hers, she understood that saving his life had placed her inside a world where even kindness could feel like a contract. When Camila stepped back into the service wing, it felt like the hotel had quietly changed its mind about her. The corridors that used to swallow her presence now seemed to hold it, as if the walls were repeating her name. A supervisor avoided her eyes and spoke in a careful tone, the kind people use when they're thinking about liability instead of human beings. Co-workers paused their work just long enough to stare, then looked away too fast, like attention itself might get them in trouble. Camila kept moving, tray balanced, smile practiced, but inside she could feel the bruise forming, not on her skin, but somewhere deeper. On the floor, the brunch crowd had thinned, yet the air still smelled wrong, sweet champagne spoiled by dust and panic. Guests whispered behind napkins, phones angled low, catching pictures that would turn her into a rumor by lunchtime. One woman looked at Camila's speckled sleeve and asked, half-joking, if she was the brave girl, as if courage were entertainment. Camila nodded politely, because that's what you do when you're paid to keep the room comfortable. But the truth was simple. Being seen like this didn't feel like honor. It felt like standing in the open with no cover. Later, a discreet envelope appeared at the staff desk with her name written neatly on the front. Inside was a card for a private clinic, a phone number that didn't belong to the hotel, and a message with no signature, for your care, for your safety. Damian's kind of help arrived like everything else in his world, efficient, silent, unquestioning. Camila's fingers hovered over the card, and for a moment she hated how relieved she felt. Relief can be a trap when it makes you forget who holds the door. Still, she tucked the number into her pocket beside the rosary, keeping them close like two different kinds of protection. That evening, as she left through the employee entrance, the sky already dimming into steel, she noticed the street in the way she always had. Quick glances, counting steps, listening for rhythm changes. A car, idled across the road, not the same spot as the valet, but close enough to feel intentional. Two men stood by it pretending to talk, eyes drifting back to the door like they were measuring the flow of staff. Camila kept her pace steady and didn't turn her head too much because fear is loud when you feed it. But as she reached the corner, she felt it clearly. She wasn't invisible anymore, and someone out there liked it that way. The next morning, the city wore its normal face again. Traffic, coffee lines, people pretending danger was something that happened to someone else. Inside Damian Cross's world, though, the air had thickened. Meetings multiplied in glass-walled rooms that suddenly didn't feel safe, and every sentence sounded like it had an invisible footnote. The board wanted reassurance, investors wanted certainty, and security wanted to control the story before the story controlled them. Damian listened with that calm, unblinking expression he'd built over decades, but something had shifted. He had felt a body cover him, and for the first time in a long time, he couldn't pretend he was untouchable. Victor Langford arrived like a prayer offered by someone who didn't believe in God. Smooth, public, perfectly timed. He sent statements condemning violence, promised cooperation, and showed up with sympathetic eyes that never warmed. Cameras loved him. So did nervous executives who preferred stability over truth. Victor spoke of safety and market confidence with a voice as polished as his cufflinks, and in every word was the quiet suggestion that Damian was becoming a risk. Pride rose in Damian like an old reflex. He would not be seen as weak, not by the board, not by Victor, not by anyone. That pride pushed him toward solitude, toward handling it alone, because asking for trust felt like admitting he needed it. Camila felt the weight of pride in a different way, quieter but just as heavy. She refused to let fear make her beg, refused to let anyone treat her courage like a bargaining chip. Yet she could sense the world tightening around her. The hotel's sudden distance, the hush when she walked into a room, the way management smiled as if she were both hero and hazard. When she checked her phone, there were messages from numbers she didn't recognize. Empty texts, missed calls that left no voicemail, silence that still sounded like a warning. She told herself it could be nothing, but her instincts didn't agree. By afternoon, Damian's security insisted Camila be moved, temporarily, for her protection. Words that sounded kind until you heard the steel beneath them. Camila stood in the staff hallway with her bag in her hand, feeling the unfairness of being treated like a problem when she'd been the one to stop a tragedy. Damian appeared again, and this time he didn't speak like a man paying a debt. He spoke like a man trying to hold control with both hands. Camila met his gaze and understood something sharp. The danger wasn't only outside his empire, it was inside it, smiling in meetings and shaking hands. And if that was true, then the safest place might be the one that felt least safe of all. It happened before dawn had fully lifted. One clean blow delivered in silence, the way professionals end things. Damian's phone began to vibrate with alerts that stacked like falling dominoes. A sudden regulatory inquiry, a frozen line of credit, a leaked document framed to look like confession. By the time the city finished its first coffee, headlines were already sharpening their teeth. The board's group chat went from concern to distance in a matter of minutes, the kind of cold that wears polite words. Damian stared at the numbers on his screens and felt, for the first time, what it meant to be cornered without a single hand laid on you. In the main conference room, faces that used to smile at him now watched like jurors. Someone suggested a temporary step back, as if stepping back from your own life could ever be temporary. Another executive spoke too calmly about stability, and Damian heard the truth under it. They're preparing to replace you. Pride urged him to fight louder, to crush the panic with force, but force is useless when the battlefield is paperwork and timing. He thought of the attack at the hotel and understood the design with a sick clarity. This wasn't just an attempt on his body. It was an attempt on his name, his control, his very existence. Across town, Camila walked into the hotel expecting another tense shift and found her name erased as if it had never belonged there. The manager called her into an office that smelled like printer ink and fake air freshener, speaking in a voice meant to sound compassionate. "For your safety," she said, sliding a paper across the desk like it was an apology. Camila stared at it. Termination, effective immediately. Her hours gone, her badge invalid, her access revoked. The words landed like a slap that didn't leave a mark, because the worst wounds are the ones that pretend to be policy. She left through the employee exit with a cardboard box that suddenly felt too light for what it carried. On the sidewalk, the wind tugged at her hair, and the city moved around her as if she were just another person who didn't matter. When she reached her apartment building, she noticed the first sign. The lock's metal rim slightly scraped, as if someone had tested it with patience. Inside, her space looked almost normal. Almost. But the air felt disturbed, like a room that had been searched by hands, trying not to leave fingerprints. On the kitchen counter, beside her worn rosary, lay a folded napkin from the hotel brunch, pristine except for 3 words written in neat ink. "Stop talking, or else." Camila sat on the edge of her bed with the lights off, listening to the building breathe. Pipes ticking, an elevator groaning, footsteps passing and fading like questions that didn't want answers. The napkin lay on her small kitchen table, flattened beneath a spoon, as if weight could make the words less real. "Stop talking, or else." She read it again anyway, because fear has a habit of demanding proof. Her fingers found the rosary in her pocket, the beads worn smooth, and she held it tight enough to feel each ridge press into her skin. In the dark, she tried to pray, but her thoughts kept slipping back to the same image. The gloved hand, the metal tube, the glass turning to glitter in the air. She told herself she could run, she could disappear the way she always had, change routes, stay with a cousin, become small again until the world forgot her name. But the world didn't forget things like this. It collected them. She pictured Damian Cross standing up behind her that morning, stunned, alive because of her, and the memory cut 2 ways: pride and dread. If she stayed silent, she might survive. But what would it cost someone else? If she spoke, she might lose everything she had left. The question wasn't dramatic. It was simple, heavy, and ordinary, the kind that settles into your ribs and won't leave. Across the city, Damian's office glowed high above the streets, a clean rectangle of light that suddenly felt like an aquarium. Screens flickered with breaking news and market chatter, and each headline sounded like a verdict written by people who had never met him. His board had gone distant, his advisors careful, and his security team moved like a tightening fist. He had money, lawyers, influence, yet for the first time those things felt like furniture in a burning room. Damian loosened his tie and stared at the skyline, realizing that trust was the one asset he couldn't purchase at any price. Someone inside his empire had opened the door for the attack, and the thought sat in his stomach like ice. He thought about Camila, the way she moved without permission, the way she didn't hesitate, the way she covered him like he was a person and not a brand. Everyone around him wanted to manage her, hide her, hush her, relocate her, file her away as a risk. Yet in that single second, she had done what none of his systems had done. She had been human, and that had saved him. Damian's jaw tightened, not with anger, but with something that felt unfamiliar, responsibility that couldn't be delegated. He picked up his phone and hovered over the number his team had given him for witness management, then stopped. He didn't want management. He wanted truth. In her apartment, Camila stood and checked the lock again, then the window, then the hallway peephole, moving the way she used to move when she was a kid and the neighborhood went quiet too early. The city outside looked normal. Streetlights, distant cars, a neighbor's TV glow, yet her body refused to believe in normal. She pressed her forehead to the cool glass and let out a slow breath, trying to decide what bravery meant when no one was watching. Somewhere men with patience and planning were expecting her to fold. Camila closed her eyes, and in the silence her instincts returned like a whisper with teeth. Tomorrow she would either speak or vanish. Camila woke before her alarm, heart already awake, as if it had been running all night. She didn't turn on the lights. She'd learned that brightness can make you feel safe when you're not. And she moved through her small kitchen by memory, fingertips brushing the counter's edge. The napkin was still there, the words still sharp, the spoon still pinning them down like a lie. She made coffee she barely tasted and listened to the hallway for footsteps that lingered too long. Then her phone buzzed once, short and clean, from an unknown number. "Don't go back there, I saw something." The message was followed by an address and a time, nothing more, like someone afraid to leave a trail. Camila stared at the screen until her eyes burned, weighing risk the way she'd always weighed it, quietly, quickly, with no room for fantasy. She thought about ignoring it, about shrinking back into her old invisibility, but the memory of the sedan and that gloved hand wouldn't let her. She tucked the rosary into her pocket, slipped on a plain jacket, and left the apartment with her head down and her senses up. On the street, she chose a longer route with more people, because crowds can be cover if you know how to use them. Across town, Damian Cross watched his world tilt further as the morning's market chatter hardened into panic. A junior analyst, young, pale, with eyes that wouldn't quite meet his, was brought into a secure room after requesting a private conversation, off record. The kid spoke in fragments at first, swallowing fear between sentences, then finally pushed a printed email forward with shaking hands. It wasn't a smoking gun, not yet, but it was a thread. Instructions to reroute security contracts, to delay an equipment upgrade, to approve a vendor tied to a shell company. Damian recognized the name on the approval chain, someone trusted, someone close enough to touch the center. He felt a cold, focused anger rise, not wild, but precise. Damian didn't celebrate the discovery. He understood what it meant. If the betrayal was inside his own walls, then every polished hallway could hide a knife, and every friendly handshake could be a signal. His security chief urged him to tighten the perimeter, to move assets, to keep Camila quiet and safe and distant. Damian heard the plan and sensed its weakness. Control wasn't the same as truth. He dismissed the room, then did something he rarely did. He made a decision based on conscience instead of optics. He sent his personal driver, not a team, to a location he chose himself, and he wrote a message with his own hands. "I believe you. I need what you saw." Camila arrived at the address, an old church office tucked between storefronts, the kind of place that smelled like candles and paper and quiet promises. An older hotel employee waited inside, a woman with tired eyes and steady hands, the kind of person who has seen enough to stop being impressed by luxury. She didn't waste words. "There was a man by the glass," she said softly, sliding a small folded note across the desk. "Not staff, not guest, and I saw who let him in." Camilla's stomach tightened as she read the name, because it wasn't Victor Langford's name. It was someone closer, someone safer, someone who shouldn't have been part of this at all. Damian's car didn't stop at the church door. It stopped a half-block away, because even men with private jets learn to walk when the air turns hostile. He came in through the side entrance, alone, except for a driver waiting at the curb like a silent safeguard. Inside, the narrow hallway smelled of candle wax and old paper, and the light was soft enough to make the world feel slower. Camila watched him approach and realized how different he looked outside the hotel's shine. Still controlled, still precise, but no longer untouchable. His eyes found hers the same way they had under the shattered glass, measured and guarded, yet warmed by something new, awareness. Camila didn't smile. Smiles can be mistaken for permission. She placed the folded note on the small desk between them, as if she were laying down a blade, careful not to cut herself. Damian read the name once, then again, and his jaw tightened, not in dramatic anger, but in the clean shape of understanding. In the corner of the room, a worn chessboard sat on a shelf from some old youth program, pieces frozen mid-match, as if the game had been interrupted by real life. Camilla's mind latched onto it immediately, because that's what this felt like. Moves made long before the players realized they were on the board. Damian spoke quietly, choosing words like he chose investments, carefully, with no waste. He admitted what pride hated most. Someone close had opened a door inside his empire, close enough to sabotage security and plant disaster with perfect timing. Camila told him what her body remembered even when her mind tried to forget. The black sedan returning, the third time, the calm, gloved hand near the glass, the napkin message pinned under a spoon, the scraped lock that proved someone had tested her home. Damian listened without interrupting, and the silence between them didn't feel empty. It felt loaded, like the pause before a second strike. He offered protection again, but this time it didn't sound like a transaction wrapped in velvet. It sounded like responsibility, the kind that can't be delegated to a team with earpieces. Camila felt her old survival instinct rise, stay invisible, stay small, disappear, and live. But it ran into a harder truth that had been growing since New Year's morning. If she vanished, the people who planned this would simply choose another witness, another target, another life to erase. Damian asked one simple question, and it wasn't about money, headlines, or control. Will you help me prove it? Camila swallowed, feeling the weight of her answer settle into her chest, because saving him might mean losing the last safe corner of her own life. The proof didn't arrive like a movie confession. It arrived like a stain that wouldn't wash out. Damian brought Camila to a quiet, safe suite above a closed office floor, where the carpet muted footsteps and the curtains stayed drawn even in daylight. A single desk lamp cast a circle of light over printed emails, security logs, and vendor invoices. Paper trails that looked boring until you understood they could kill. Camila sat close enough to see the ink tremble slightly when Damian's hand moved it, the first sign that all his control had edges. Outside the window the city kept moving, indifferent, as if truth was just another traffic pattern. The name on the note led them to a person Damian had trusted, someone with access to schedules, contractors, and the kind of small approvals that never look dangerous until they're stacked. A security subcontract had been rerouted weeks earlier, signed off with a casual digital stamp. A camera upgrade had been delayed for budget timing with the same signature. A valet access list had been edited the morning of the brunch. Each detail alone looked like routine. Together they formed a shape, clean, intentional, patient. Camila felt her stomach tighten the way it had when she saw the sedan for the third time, because this pattern didn't belong to chance. Then her memory sharpened into something cruelly clear. The man near the glass wall. She could see him again, not as a blur but as a certainty, the posture that didn't match the room, the way his eyes tracked exits instead of people, the calmness that didn't belong at a celebration. And suddenly she remembered a second face, too. Someone she'd glimpsed earlier in the service corridor. Someone who nodded to security like they belonged there. Camila pointed to a printed badge photo on Damian's desk, her fingertip hovering before it touched the paper. "Him," she said, voice low, steady only because she forced it to be. Damian's gaze followed her finger, and something in him went still. The revelation was partial, not enough for court, not enough to stop a hostile board from pretending it wasn't real. But it was enough to prove betrayal lived inside his empire, wearing familiar shoes and using familiar passwords. Damian leaned back slowly, exhaling through his nose, as if trying to keep anger from becoming noise. "Victor didn't just want me hurt," he said, more to himself than to her. "He wanted me erased, before morning, before the bell, before anyone could question the story. He reached for one final file, a sealed internal report he'd avoided opening, and when he read the first line, his face lost its last hint of color, because the next name on the chain was closer than any enemy should ever be. Damian chose the battlefield, the way he chose everything else, deliberately. It wasn't the police station, and it wasn't a courtroom, not yet. It was a charity New Year reception in a private club where chandeliers glowed warm and people spoke softly while sharpening every sentence. Camila stood just behind the edge of the crowd in a plain black dress borrowed from a friend, her posture calm, her eyes working like a guard dog's, quiet, constant, alert. The room smelled of perfume and expensive whiskey, and the floor was so glossy it reflected smiles twice. Damian walked in with a steadiness that looked like confidence to strangers, but Camila could see the truth under it. He was holding himself together by choice, not by habit. Victor Langford greeted him with a hand extended and a sympathy smile rehearsed to perfection. "Damian," he said, voice smooth as satin, "I've been so concerned, truly." The words sounded humane, but Victor's eyes flicked, one fast glance toward Damian's shoulder, toward Camila's position, toward exits and angles like a man counting options. Damian didn't take the bait of politeness. He shook Victor's hand once, firm and brief, then released as if the contact itself was a risk. Around them donors laughed, glasses clinked, and a violin played something gentle that made the tension feel almost invisible. They moved toward a quieter corner near a wall of framed portraits, old money looking down on new money, judging in silence. Damian spoke in measured tones, not accusing wildly, not trying to win the room. "Someone altered access logs," he said. "Someone delayed security upgrades. Someone rerouted contractors." Victor's smile didn't falter, but it thinned, like ice warming under a hand. "You're under pressure," Victor replied, voice still kind, still public-friendly. "People do strange things when they're desperate." Camila felt her stomach tighten at the word desperate. It was a knife hidden inside an insult, polished enough to pass as concern. Damian didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten. He did something Victor wasn't expecting. He chose truth over dominance. "I'm not asking for favors," Damian said quietly. "I'm ending the lie." Victor's eyes sharpened for the first time, the warmth draining out as if someone had turned a dial. He lifted a champagne flute, holding it delicate and bright, an elegant object that suddenly looked like a weapon in the wrong hand. "Careful," Victor murmured, just soft enough to sound like advice and feel like a warning. And as the violin continued to sing and the party continued to pretend, Camila realized Victor wasn't here to talk his way out. He was here to decide what he'd destroy next. The proof didn't arrive with fireworks. It arrived with a quiet click, like a lock finally turning. A junior analyst Damian barely knew forwarded a file from an internal archive, something they'd been told never to open without executive clearance. It was an audio snippet, short, ugly in its simplicity, a voice giving instructions, a time window, a warning to keep it clean, followed by a name that tied the contractor chain to Victor Langford's private counsel. Damian listened without blinking, letting the sound settle into the room like smoke. Camila watched his face as the last doubt drained away, replaced by something steadier than anger, certainty. Damian moved fast after that, not with panic, but with precision. His legal team prepared documents, his compliance officers contacted regulators, and a sealed packet of evidence was delivered to the authorities before the market could twist the story again. The board tried to call an emergency vote, but Damian's attorneys arrived first with the kind of paperwork that forces powerful people to sit down and read. Camila stayed close but quiet, her senses trained on doors and corners, on the small behaviors that reveal betrayal. Outside, headlines began to change tone, first skeptical, then cautious, then hungry for the bigger truth. Victor's polished narrative started to crack in public, not because Damian shouted louder, but because facts don't need volume. The confrontation's echo reached the charity club by the next evening, when donors and executives murmured over the same champagne that had tasted normal the night before. Victor Langford's smile still appeared, but it no longer held the room the way it used to. People stepped back from him in subtle ways, pauses in conversation, eyes that didn't linger, invitations that suddenly had to be rescheduled. When investigators requested records, Victor tried to frame it as harassment, but the paper trail was patient and merciless. Camila, watching from the edge of the crowd, realized something that startled her. In this world, downfall often begins not with handcuffs, but with silence. Then came the moment Camila never expected. Damian refusing to let her be erased. In a brief statement to press and board alike, he named her without turning her into decoration, calling her courage what it was, the act that interrupted evil. He didn't speak of her like a miracle or a mascot. He spoke of her like a person who chose right over fear. Cameras flashed, questions flew, and Camila's throat tightened as her own life shifted under the weight of being seen. She had spent years surviving by being invisible, and now the world was learning her name because she'd thrown herself between danger and a stranger. That night, after the noise softened, Camila sat alone for a moment with her rosary in her palm, the beads warm from her skin. Justice had begun to move, slow, serious, inevitable, but she could feel how unfinished everything still was. Victor's scheme was collapsing, yes, yet the city had long memory and sharp teeth, and stories like this always left debris behind. Damian found her in the quiet hallway and didn't offer money first. He offered acknowledgement, the rarest kind of respect in a place built on transactions. Camila looked up at him and understood the strange truth of it all. The fight wasn't only about exposing Victor, it was about deciding what kind of people they would become after surviving him. The first morning that didn't feel like a chase arrived quietly, almost shy, as if peace wasn't sure it was allowed. Camila woke in the safe suite to a pale stripe of sunlight on the carpet and the soft hum of the city behaving normally again. No strange footsteps outside the door, no unknown numbers lighting her phone, just the ordinary sounds of life continuing, distant traffic, an elevator bell, someone laughing somewhere far below. She sat at the small table with her coffee and realized her hands weren't shaking, and that small fact felt like a miracle she didn't want to name out loud. Damian came later without a crowd, without the armor of a dozen advisors. He looked tired in a human way, like a man who'd been forced to meet himself at the edge of something sharp. He didn't begin with contracts. He didn't begin with publicity. He placed a folder on the table and said gently that he wanted to repair what his world had damaged, not only for her, but for people like her who stayed invisible until something terrible demanded they be seen. Inside were options, not orders. Support for school if she wanted it, a role that wouldn't trap her, and a small foundation proposal that would fund emergency aid for hotel workers and service staff caught in violence they never chose. "You decide," he said, and Camila felt the difference between being managed and being respected. Still, fear doesn't vanish just because kindness shows up. Camila stared at the folder and felt that old instinct push back. Don't step too close to power. Power has teeth. She imagined walking into boardrooms where voices could slice without raising volume, imagined being watched again, labeled again, turned into a symbol instead of a person. Damian didn't rush her. He sat there and waited, hands folded, as if learning patience was part of his own penance. For the first time since January 1st, Camila let herself consider a future that wasn't built purely on survival. Then the knock came. 3 short taps, controlled, official. A courier handed Damian a sealed envelope stamped with legal markings, the kind that makes your stomach tighten before you even read it. Damian opened it with a calm that was practiced, but his eyes changed as the first lines met him, sharpening with recognition. Camila watched the color leave his face in a slow, disciplined wave. "There's one more," he said quietly, almost like an apology to the room itself. And as Camila's rosary warmed in her palm, she understood that peace had come close enough to touch, but the past had reached out one last time to pull them back. The envelope wasn't a new threat with a gun, it was the last trap with a pen. Inside was a legal motion timed to seize Damian's voting rights at the opening bell, filed through a neutral trustee who had once sat at his table and laughed at his jokes. The name was familiar, painfully so, the quiet executive who had signed the small approvals, now trying to escape blame by finishing the takeover in paperwork. Damian didn't panic. He read, breathed, and then said the simplest thing Camila had heard him say yet, "We end this clean." By noon, the final accomplice didn't fall because Damian crushed him, but because truth boxed him in from every side. The auditors had the logs, the regulators had the trail, and a witness, an older hotel worker who had been invisible for decades, finally chose to speak on record. Damian's lawyers filed a response that turned the motion into evidence, and the board's temporary step back became an investigation. In the end, the room that once judged Damian in silence had to face its own reflection. And Camila, standing quietly beside the door, realized justice often arrives the way daylight does, slow, steady, impossible to argue with. Weeks later, the city softened around them. Camila returned to work, but not as a rumor with a name tag. This time, she walked into a place where she was treated like a person, not a convenience. Damian rebuilt his company in a way he'd never considered before. Stronger security, yes, but also a different culture, one where service staff were protected, heard, and never punished for surviving. The foundation he proposed became real, small at first, then steady, helping workers who'd been one bad moment away from losing everything. Camila kept her rosary, not as a shield, but as a reminder that courage can live in ordinary pockets. On the next January morning, sunlight spilled across clean glass that didn't shatter, and the world looked quieter in a good way. Camila stood by a window and watched the city move without flinching, feeling the rare comfort of a day that didn't demand she disappear. Damian, across town, paused in his office and let himself feel gratitude without turning it into a transaction. Because the moral had settled into both of them like warm breath in cold air, kindness can interrupt evil, and humility can rebuild what pride almost destroyed. If this story touched your heart, leave a heart in the comments and subscribe for more stories about kindness and redemption. And to everyone listening, we wish you a happy new year, filled with peace, protection, and new beginnings.